Honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the opportunity to speak to colleagues in this chamber today. I'm here before you in two capacities. One is the Member of Parliament for Scarborough-Guildwood, but also the other capacity is as co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group, the APPG, to end human trafficking and modern slavery. As you can see, the APPG has two tasks. One, supply chain slavery, and the second is human trafficking. Today, we are speaking about the second task, but I also want to take this opportunity to speak about the first a little later on. Mr. Speaker, I don't know whether you or colleagues know the name William Wilberforce and whether that in fact means anything to you, but to me, he's one of the finest examples of what a determined non-cabinet member MP can do when legislative odds are stacked against him or her. He was the member for Yorkshire from 1780 until 1825, some 45 years. He was asked several times to become a minister in several different governments, but declined each time because God had set before him two great tasks, one of which was the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. At the time, the British Empire reigned supreme throughout the world. Its economic foundation was the slave trade. Slaves went from Africa to the Americas, and then slave products came from the Americas to Britain, and then the slaves returned back to Africa to pick up more slaves. The monies generated from those slave products constituted 80% of Great Britain's foreign income. Wilberforce set out to turn the economic underpinnings of the British Empire on its head, a formidable task from a relatively weak position. However, with persistence, luck, procedural smarts, and hard work, he was witness to the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. He died three days later. Mr. Speaker, I tell you that story to say two things. One, slavery is still not being abolished in Canada. And two, persistence, hard work, and some luck can yield results. Humans are still being trafficked in 2021. I know it's shocking, Mr. Speaker, and I don't know how a country like Canada that calls itself civilized can allow this to continue. You will hear statistics repeated over the course of this debate, and I realize that statistics don't necessarily tell the entire story, but 45% of the victims that are reported to police between the ages of 18 and 24. And even more shocking, Mr. Speaker, 28% are under 18. 97% are girls and women. According to a 2014 report by the Canadian Women's Foundation, 50% of trafficked girls and 51% of trafficked women are Indigenous. Mr. Speaker, these are statistics, and they frankly don't speak to the human suffering that is behind them. Stalin once said, "A single death is a tragedy, but 1,000,000 deaths are a statistic." Let's not forget that behind every statistic is a human tragedy. Speaker, this day is long overdue. Initiated by Joy Smith, former member from Kilgolden, St. Paul, February 22nd has been proclaimed by Ontario, Alberta, multiple Canadian cities, and indeed in the United States. Thanks to the persistence of my colleague, the member from Peace River Westlock, and the able assistance of the member from Shefford and Senator Julie Milvain-Duchesne, and the welcome support from the member of Edmonton Strathcona and the member from Saanich Gulf Islands, February 22nd is about to be designated as Human Trafficking Awareness Day. I also want to take recognition of those who work with us on these initiatives. And in my office, it's Sean Boyle and Janessa Loss and Inessa DeAngelis, and then the member from Peace River Westlock, it's Joel Oosterman. These are the kinds of initiatives that are really full-on efforts by entire offices, and I want to recognize each and every one of them for their considerable effort to make sure that we are talking about this today. This was originally conceived as a unanimous consent motion, and I particularly want to thank the leadership of the government for cooperating in that anticipated motion. The fact that the unanimous consent motion has been overtaken by this concurrence motion is irrelevant to the greater scheme of things, and the member for Peace River Westlock can take some satisfaction in a job well done. Shortly, you will hear about all of the government's efforts to rid our nation of this scourge. Some will criticize it as too little too late, but just before members get too enthusiastic about criticizing the government, I would encourage them to look in the mirror. Governments, after all, are elected and reflect our priorities. Has human trafficking received enough attention? Of course not, Mr. Speaker. Should it receive more attention? Of course it should, Mr. Speaker. Will it receive more attention? Well, I'd like to think that our efforts today will help, and hopefully this motion will shine a light on this national scourge. That is, after all, the point of this motion. I want to, at this point, turn to the other initiative of APPG, the effort to expose the supply chain slavery in Canadian products. World Vision estimates that Canadians consume about $34 billion in goods annually that contain some elements of slavery in the supply chain. World Vision further estimates that 1,200 Canadian companies are importing slave-made products, while Walk Free Foundation conservatively estimates that some 40 million people are enslaved globally. Bill S-216, sponsored by Senator Julie Milvain-Duchesne, and its predecessor, C-423, which was sponsored by me, required that companies of significant size be required to report annually to the Minister of Public Safety that the company has examined its supply chain and is satisfied that no slavery exists in it. The bill has been enthusiastically embraced by many NGOs and corporations, all of whom understand the moral hazard argument and the human rights arguments against slavery, but also find themselves in an economically disadvantaged position when competing with slave labor. Multiple examples have been highlighted recently in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and the CBC. We are urging the government to take over this bill, not only for its obvious human rights and moral arguments, but also because it creates a competitive disadvantage that Canadian companies find themselves in when competing with slave labor. In addition, it should be noted that the Canadian government will be negotiating a free trade agreement with Great Britain in the next number of months. Great Britain has been a legislative leader in this field and has been a model piece of legislation, not only for S-216, but also for a number of other pieces of legislation around the world. Great Britain will be hosting the G7, and while no one publicly knows the agenda, Canada would be in a much better position if we had robust supply chain legislation rather than what currently exists. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'd urge colleagues to support this motion. I encourage the good work of the APPG, but in the words of William Wilberforce, you can choose to look the other way, but you can never say that you did not know. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your time and attention.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. You know, it's great to hear. You know, we have a topic today where people from all parties are all on the same page on this topic. So I would just want to ask him, you know, tangibly speaking, what are the next steps that we need to take here in Parliament? You know, he alluded to it a little bit in his speech, but if he wants to elaborate on that further as to what the next steps need to be and what we should be focusing on here.
For Scarborough Guildwood.
I would be very encouraged if, in fact, the enforcement mechanisms were stepped up. It's not as if this is an unknown problem. This is a known problem. And it would be encouraging if, as a result of awareness, the Canadian public said to those enforcement agencies, whether it's the RCMP or others, we want you to act on this on these matters. And I think that would be a welcome outcome of this day where we recognize human trafficking. The second outcome is, as I alluded to, with respect to supply chain slavery, because not only is trafficking of human beings inextricably linked to supply chain slavery, but so also is supply chain slavery inextricably linked to human trafficking. And were the government to see fit, I think it would be a happy outcome if, in fact, S216 or some version thereof be adopted sooner rather than later.
Questions and commentaires?
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I enjoyed my colleague's speech. I think it's great that we're here discussing this very sensitive and serious topic. When you're talking about human trafficking, I agree about the symbolic value of having a day, but we're talking about crime here. And when you talk about crime, you have to talk also about poverty. So when we talk about symbols and awareness, couldn't the government invest heavily in anti-poverty measures like housing, domestic violence support, addiction support? These are all issues that feed into the problem we're discussing today. So could we go beyond symbols and invest heavily in anti-poverty measures? The honourable member for Scarborough Guildwood.
Thank the honourable member for his question. While not directly on point, I think he does make a valid point. Certainly the social economic conditions of any society writ large do yield to people being involved in things like supply chain slavery or human trafficking, because the people that are the victims of this clearly in many instances have little or no choice. The concept of consent is a bit dubious. It may be clear in lawyers' minds, but nowhere else. Clearly, many of the people behind the statistics cited by me and other colleagues clearly indicate that conditions of poverty yield these kinds of outcomes. And so it behooves us all to, in my judgment, get behind a number of the initiatives that have been put forward with respect to poverty alleviation by this government and previous ones.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for London, Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable colleague for his speech today. One of the things that concerns me in my riding in London, Ontario, human trafficking is a growing issue of concern for sure. And we actually experienced one of the major providers of programs and supports for victims of trafficking. They had their funding cut and stopped. And this was a result of a previous government giving funding under a project-based funding model, and the current government also doing the same thing. But right in the middle of the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, that funding was cut, and they were scrambling to try and find alternate resources. And ultimately, that impacts those victims of human trafficking. So maybe he could talk about the impacts of governments not providing core, long-term, operational-based funding and what his government's going to do to resolve that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
I thank the honourable member for her question, and have been made aware of this issue by my Liberal colleagues in the London area, and it certainly does seem to be a regrettable situation. I can't speak specifically to the issue that is raised by the honourable member, but funding is certainly one element of making sure that the consequences of human trafficking are mitigated and alleviated. I am concerned that we sometimes have these programs after the horse is out of the barn, that it would be much better if, in fact, people didn't find themselves in situations where they're effectively without their consent, forced into situations which in 2021, every one of us would find appalling.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his excellent speech. I found it particularly interesting, his discussion of the economic impact on the British Empire of the abolition of slavery, or the potential impact. I know a little bit about the story of Wilberforce, but this was a detail I wasn't aware of, and it really underlines how doing the right thing can often involve economic sacrifice, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise when we're fighting for fundamental justice. I wonder if the member can, further to the issue of supply chains, share his perspective on the government announcement with respect to supply chains and East Turkestan. This was presented as a measure to address the trafficking of Uyghurs and slave labor involving Uyghurs in the People's Republic of China. Some have considered this measure inadequate. What's his response to it, and maybe comparisons between those measures and what is called for by Bill S-216?
Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
I thank the honourable member for his work, for his question, and recognize that he has done a great deal of work with respect to Uyghurs and other human rights issues. Let me first of all speak about the economic consequences of Wilberforce's initiatives, and I don't think it can be understated. This was a member for 45 years in the House of Commons in Great Britain, who, from a position of weakness, literally upended the entire economic underpinnings of the British Empire with the abolition of the slave trade. And it had huge consequences. Even had huge consequences here, because when we were a colony of Great Britain, and when the British Empire abolished slave trade, we necessarily followed suit. So you're right to point out that this will have economic consequences. This will potentially have economic consequences, particularly in the supply chain. And let me just go to a little incident. I have a good friend who represents a very large fish and seafood products company based in the East Coast, and they are highly supportive of S-216 because they find themselves competing with shrimp boats that have slaves on them from the South China Sea. And because those slave boats, for want of a better term, can produce fish products and seafood products at an extraordinarily low level, and they get imported into Canada, the consequence of that is that my friend's company ends up in an economically competitive disadvantage. I can also say that about a number of other.
We're going to try and just get one more question in. Question commentaire, l'honorable député de Shefford.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Shefford. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague who I've worked with at the multi-party group against modern slavery. Now, we've talked about poverty and the consequences of modern-day slavery, but I'd like to hear more about his ideas to support the victims and survivors of this tragic phenomenon.
Data Scarborough Guildwood.
Thank the honourable member for her contribution. It's a very welcome contribution to the APPG group, and indeed there are quite a number of tasks to be done. I particularly want to take recognition that the government initiated the Canada Child Benefit. In my writing, this means a huge thing. This is huge for us. So I think, for my writing, it means about $100 million a year coming into to impoverished families. That has led to the greatest reduction in child poverty in all of Canada. And so that was, as I say, that's a very welcome initiative. I don't know how that plays through to reduction in human trafficking, but I have to think that initiatives like the Canada Child Benefit, like CERB, are welcome additions to people who are most marginalized. And if you're marginalized, you're more likely to get yourself involved in the human trafficking and other such events. So I think that those two initiatives have been, as I say, welcome initiatives to the reduction in human trafficking. You can't draw a straight line between A and Z. But improvement in the socioeconomic conditions of the most marginalized is, in my judgment, welcome initiatives and feeds directly into the reduction in human trafficking. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.